On March 15, 2019, Dr. Sarah Martinez, a pediatric geneticist at Emory University Hospital in Atlanta, received a call that would haunt her for years. The voice on the other end belonged to Sheriff Robert Hayes from rural Telfair County, Georgia, reporting what he described as the most disturbing family situation he'd encountered in 30 years of law enforcement. A child had been brought to the county hospital with severe developmental delays and physical abnormalities that defied medical explanation. What started as a routine medical evaluation quickly spiraled into something far more sinister when genetic testing revealed an impossible biological relationship. The woman caring for the child was simultaneously the mother, aunt, and grandmother to the same little girl. The family lived in complete isolation on a 47-acre property deep in the pine forests of southern Georgia, where 3 generations had created their own twisted version of reality. For decades, they had operated under a web of relationships so complex and disturbing that even seasoned investigators struggled to map the family tree. The truth behind this case would expose a multi-generational cycle of abuse, genetic manipulation, and systematic isolation that authorities had somehow missed for over 40 years. If you think you can handle the disturbing truth behind this case, let me know in the comments. And if you want to explore more cases that authorities tried to keep hidden, subscribe now, because what we uncovered will change how you see isolated communities forever. The Whitmore family first settled in Telfair County in 1952 when patriarch Jonas Whitmore purchased the remote property with money inherited from his deceased father's timber business. Jonas, a 34-year-old widower with 2 young daughters, Sarah and Mary, sought isolation after what neighbors described as troubles with the law in his previous home of Valdosta, Georgia. The 47-acre plot sat 15 miles from the nearest neighbor, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that became impassable during heavy rains. Jonas deliberately chose this location for its remoteness, claiming he wanted to live by God's law, not man's. He homeschooled his daughters using only religious texts and forbade any contact with outsiders. By 1960, county records show that the family had stopped participating in any community activities, including church services they had briefly attended upon arrival. Local postal workers noted that mail delivery to the property ceased in 1963, with Jonas claiming they were self-sufficient in all things. The property itself consisted of the original 1940s farmhouse, which Jonas expanded over the years into a sprawling compound with multiple additions connected by covered walkways. Power lines reached the property in 1965, but phone service was never installed. Jonas maintained several outbuildings, including a workshop, storage facilities, and what neighbors later described as living quarters separate from the main house. By the 1970s, the Whitmore property had become local legend. Hunting parties occasionally spotted family members from a distance, but attempts at friendly contact were met with aggressive warnings to stay away. The few county officials who ventured onto the property over the decades were turned away by Jonas, who claimed constitutional rights to privacy and threatened legal action against trespassers. The investigation began when 23-year-old Rebecca Whitmore collapsed at a Walmart in nearby McRae, Georgia, on March 10, 2019, while shopping with a young child. Store employees called 911 when Rebecca began seizing violently in the checkout line. Paramedic Jennifer Collins later testified that she immediately noticed Rebecca's unusual physical characteristics: severe dental malformation, stunted growth despite her adult age, and cognitive responses that seemed childlike despite her identification showing she was born in 1996. More disturbing was the condition of the child with her, a girl who appeared to be around 6 years old but moved with the unsteady gait of someone with severe neurological damage. The child, later identified as Emma Whitmore, had profound developmental delays, partial blindness, and physical deformities consistent with genetic disorders. When questioned, Rebecca could only repeat that Emma was her baby and that they needed to get home to Papa. Sheriff Hayes responded to the hospital after doctors expressed concerns about possible neglect. Dr. Lisa Patterson, the emergency room physician, noted that both Rebecca and Emma showed signs of chronic malnutrition and medical neglect. Emma's condition was particularly alarming. She was nonverbal, showed signs of hearing loss, and had physical deformities, including fused fingers and an underdeveloped jaw. Hayes attempted to contact family members using the address on Rebecca's identification, but found no phone number listed. When he drove to the Whitmore property the following day, he encountered a locked gate with no trespassing signs and religious warnings posted every few feet. After shouting for several minutes, an elderly man emerged from behind trees. Jonas Whitmore, now 101 years old, but still mobile and clearly agitated by the intrusion. Jonas initially refused to discuss Rebecca or Emma, claiming they were God's business, not the government's. Only when Hayes threatened to return with a warrant did Jonas admit that Rebecca was his granddaughter and Emma was Rebecca's daughter. However, when Hayes pressed for information about Emma's father, Jonas became evasive, mumbling about God's plan and insisting that all family matters were handled according to Scripture. The sheriff left that day with more questions than answers, but something about Jonas's demeanor and the family's extreme isolation triggered his instincts. He contacted Child Protective Services and requested a welfare check, setting in motion an investigation that would uncover decades of hidden secrets. The breakthrough came when Dr. Martinez conducted comprehensive genetic testing on both Rebecca and Emma while they remained at the hospital for medical evaluation. What she discovered challenged everything she knew about human genetics and family relationships. The DNA analysis revealed that Emma's genetic markers showed an unprecedented level of consanguinity, a coefficient of inbreeding that should have been mathematically impossible in a normal family structure. Dr. Martinez later testified, "In 30 years of genetic medicine, I had never seen anything like it. Emma's DNA showed that her parents were not just related, they were siblings who shared both parents. But it went deeper than that. The genetic analysis indicated that Emma's grandmother and great-grandmother were the same person, which meant that multiple generations of incestuous relationships had created this child. The horrifying truth emerged through careful genetic mapping. Rebecca was simultaneously Emma's mother, aunt, and grandmother through a complex web of relationships spanning 3 generations. Jonas Whitmore had fathered children with his own daughters, Sarah and Mary, in the 1970s. Those children, including Rebecca's mother, Ruth, had then been forced into relationships with their half-siblings. Rebecca herself was the product of a union between Ruth and her half-brother Daniel, both children of Jonas, but by different mothers. Medical examinations revealed the devastating impact of this multi-generational inbreeding. Emma suffered from a rare combination of genetic disorders that Dr. Martinez had only read about in medical textbooks: severe intellectual disability, multiple physical deformities, and a condition called inbreeding depression that affected every system in her body. Her immune system was so compromised that a common cold could prove fatal. Rebecca's condition was equally tragic. At 23, she had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old, severe learning disabilities, and multiple health issues, including early-onset osteoporosis and a heart defect. Psychological evaluation revealed that she had been completely isolated from the outside world and believed that the abuse she suffered was normal family behavior. The investigation team, now including FBI specialists in child abuse cases, uncovered disturbing evidence during a search of the Whitmore property. Hidden in Jonas's workshop, they found detailed records dating back to the 1960s that documented the family's breeding program. Jonas had kept meticulous notes about which family members were paired together, tracking pregnancies and births like a livestock operation. Agent Patricia Reynolds, who led the federal investigation, described finding journals where Jonas justified his actions through twisted religious interpretations. He believed he was creating a pure bloodline chosen by God. The journals contained detailed genealogical charts showing how he systematically paired family members to maintain what he called genetic purity. He had convinced multiple generations that this was their religious duty. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of graves on the property, small mounds that investigators later determined contained the remains of children who had died from genetic disorders. Jonas had been the family's sole decision-maker for decades, determining who lived, who died, and who would bear children, all while maintaining complete isolation from any authority that might intervene. As investigators delved deeper into the Whitmore family history, a pattern of systematic abuse and manipulation spanning 5 decades emerged. FBI genealogist Dr. Michael Chen worked with local historians to reconstruct the family tree, revealing that Jonas had begun abusing his daughters Sarah and Mary when they reached adolescence in the early 1960s. Court documents would later show that Jonas convinced his daughters that bearing his children was God's commandment, and that contact with outsiders would bring divine punishment. Sarah, who died in 1987 under suspicious circumstances, bore Jonas 4 children between 1965 and 1973. Mary, still alive but severely mentally impaired when discovered, had given birth to 6 children by Jonas between 1970 and 1981. These children, Rebecca's parents and aunts and uncles, were raised believing that incestuous relationships were normal and divinely ordained. Detective Maria Santos, who specialized in generational abuse cases, uncovered evidence that several family members had attempted to escape over the years. In 1985, Sarah's eldest son, David, managed to reach a neighbor's house and begged for help. However, when deputies responded to the complaint, Jonas convinced them that David was mentally ill and had wandered off during an episode. David was returned to the property and, according to recovered journals, was severely punished and kept confined until his death from natural causes in 1989. The investigation revealed that Jonas maintained control through a combination of religious indoctrination, physical punishment, and complete information control. He convinced family members that government authorities would separate families and that the outside world was filled with evil. Children were never taught to read beyond basic biblical passages and had no concept of normal family relationships or legal protections. Medical records hidden in the main house showed that Jonas performed his own medical care for family members, often letting children with severe genetic disorders die rather than seeking outside help. Dr. Patricia Wong, a forensic anthropologist, estimated that at least 12 children had died on the property over 4 decades, most from preventable genetic conditions that could have been treated with proper medical care. The psychological evaluation of surviving family members revealed the depth of Jonas's manipulation. Mary, now 71 and barely functional, still believed that bearing children with her father and sons was her religious duty. She showed no understanding that the relationships were abusive or illegal, having been so thoroughly conditioned that she viewed the abuse as normal family life. Dr. Martinez's comprehensive medical analysis of the Whitmore family provided unprecedented insight into the devastating effects of multi-generational inbreeding. Emma's genetic profile showed a consanguinity coefficient of 0.5, meaning her parents shared approximately 50% of their DNA, equivalent to a parent-child relationship rather than the typical sibling coefficient of 0.25. This extreme level of genetic similarity had catastrophic consequences for her development. Emma represents one of the most severe cases of inbreeding depression ever documented in medical literature, Dr. Martinez explained to the court. Her genetic profile shows homozygosity for multiple recessive alleles that would normally be extremely rare. This combination has resulted in what we term genetic load, the accumulation of harmful mutations that typically remain hidden in diverse populations. Emma suffered from a cluster of conditions, including severe microcephaly, which limited her brain development, multiple skeletal malformations affecting her spine and limbs, and immune deficiency that made her vulnerable to life-threatening infections. Her hearing loss and partial blindness were direct results of genetic disorders that occur when harmful recessive genes are expressed due to parental similarity. Dr. James Patterson, a clinical geneticist from the Centers for Disease Control, used the Whitmore case to study rare genetic disorders. His research, published in the Journal of Medical Genetics, identified 17 different genetic conditions present in various family members, conditions that had a combined probability of occurrence in the general population of less than 1 in 10 million. The surviving family members showed varying degrees of genetic damage. Rebecca's intellectual disability and physical abnormalities were consistent with second-generation inbreeding, while older family members showed different patterns based on their position in the genetic web. Some family members were surprisingly less affected, highlighting the unpredictable nature of genetic expression in inbred populations. Most significantly, Dr. Martinez's team identified several previously unknown genetic variants that appeared to be unique to the Whitmore family line. These variants, created through generations of genetic isolation, provided valuable research opportunities for understanding rare genetic diseases. However, the ethical implications of using this data sparked considerable debate in the medical community about consent and the exploitation of victims. The legal proceedings against the Whitmore family presented unprecedented challenges for prosecutors. District Attorney Robert Chen faced the complex task of determining criminal responsibility in a case where victims and perpetrators were often the same individuals across multiple generations. Jonas Whitmore, at 101 years old and showing signs of dementia, was deemed incompetent to stand trial, dying in custody before proceedings could begin. The prosecution focused on the surviving adult family members who had participated in the abuse of minors. However, defense attorneys argued that these individuals were themselves victims of systematic abuse and lacked the capacity to understand their actions were criminal. Daniel Whitmore, Rebecca's father and uncle, was ultimately sentenced to 15 years in prison after pleading guilty to multiple counts of child sexual abuse and incest. Judge Margaret Foster, who presided over the case, noted the extraordinary circumstances. This court has never encountered a situation where generational abuse has created such a complex web of victimization. While we must hold individuals accountable for their actions, we must also recognize that these defendants were themselves victims of systematic abuse from childhood. 3 other adult family members received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years, with provisions for psychological treatment and medical care. The court established a special fund for the ongoing medical and psychological care of the minor victims, recognizing that their needs would extend far beyond the criminal proceedings. The case led to legislative changes in Georgia's child protection laws, including mandatory reporting requirements for medical professionals who encounter suspected genetic evidence of abuse. The state also established specialized units within Child Protective Services trained to recognize signs of isolated family abuse and genetic disorders that might indicate incestuous relationships. Federal prosecutors also filed charges related to the isolation and control of victims, treating the case as a form of human trafficking within a family structure. The rehabilitation of the Whitmore family survivors presented unique challenges that required unprecedented coordination between medical, psychological, and social services. Emma, the most severely affected victim, was placed in a specialized care facility equipped to handle her complex medical needs. Dr. Susan Miller, the pediatric neurologist overseeing Emma's care, developed an individualized treatment program addressing her multiple genetic disorders while attempting to provide basic education and social development. Rebecca's integration into society proved particularly complex. At 23, she had the cognitive abilities of a pre-teen, but was legally an adult with a child of her own. Social worker Janet Rodriguez was assigned as Rebecca's case manager and spent months teaching her basic life skills that most people learn in childhood: how to use a telephone, understanding money, and recognizing appropriate social boundaries. Rebecca had never seen a television, used a computer, or interacted with strangers, Rodriguez recalled. Everything about the outside world was terrifying to her. We had to start with the most basic concepts of personal safety and appropriate relationships. Rebecca was eventually placed in a group home specifically designed for adults with developmental disabilities, where she receives ongoing support while learning to live independently. The rehabilitation team, led by psychologist Dr. Mark Stevens, developed specialized treatment protocols for victims of multi-generational abuse. Traditional therapy approaches proved inadequate for individuals who had no frame of reference for normal family relationships. The team created therapeutic programs using art, music, and play therapy to help victims express trauma they couldn't verbalize. Several younger family members showed remarkable resilience. 2 teenage cousins, removed from the property and placed in foster care, eventually learned to read and write at grade level and expressed interest in pursuing education. Their success provided hope that with proper support, even severely isolated children could adapt to mainstream society. The case attracted attention from researchers studying the effects of extreme isolation on human development. The Whitmore survivors became subjects of longitudinal studies examining how prolonged social isolation affects cognitive development, emotional regulation, and the ability to form healthy relationships. This research continues to inform treatment approaches for victims of similar abuse cases. The Whitmore case exposed critical gaps in rural community monitoring and child protection systems. Georgia's Department of Family and Children Services conducted a comprehensive review of their policies, revealing that the family had successfully avoided detection for decades by exploiting weaknesses in reporting requirements. The remote location, combined with Georgia's strong property rights traditions, had created a legal blind spot where systematic abuse could continue undetected. Child protection advocate Maria Santos used the case to highlight the vulnerability of children in isolated rural communities. The Whitmore case represents a perfect storm of factors that allowed abuse to continue. Geographic isolation, religious extremism used to justify abuse, and a system that prioritized parental rights over child welfare. Santos testified before the Georgia legislature. The case prompted significant changes in state law regarding mandatory reporting and welfare checks. Medical professionals are now required to report unusual genetic patterns that might indicate incestuous relationships, and social services gained expanded authority to investigate families that completely isolate themselves from community contact. Educational institutions also implemented new protocols. The Georgia Department of Education now requires annual verification of homeschooled children's welfare, including mandatory health screenings and periodic assessments by certified educators. These changes faced resistance from homeschooling advocates, but were deemed necessary to prevent similar cases. The scientific community benefited from unprecedented data about the effects of extreme inbreeding, leading to advances in genetic counseling and rare disease research. However, ethical debates continued about using data obtained from abuse victims, with some researchers arguing that the knowledge gained could help prevent future cases, while others worried about exploiting victims' suffering for academic purposes. The case also sparked broader discussions about the balance between religious freedom and child protection, as Jonas had successfully used claims of religious practice to avoid scrutiny for decades. The Whitmore case stands as a stark reminder that the most horrific abuse often occurs in plain sight, hidden behind claims of privacy and religious freedom. Emma, now receiving specialized care, represents both the devastating consequences of systematic isolation and the resilience of the human spirit. Rebecca continues her journey toward independence, slowly learning to navigate a world she never knew existed. As Dr. Martinez noted in her final report, this case shows us that genetic evidence can reveal abuse that might otherwise remain hidden, but only if we're brave enough to look for it and act on what we find. If you watched until here, it means you truly care about uncovering these hidden truths. Comment, "I watched until here," so I can recognize the real followers who aren't afraid of difficult realities. Don't forget to like this video if you believe these stories need to be told, and share it with people who value investigative content. Subscribe now for more cases that authorities hoped would stay buried forever.